To check out all our products, go to musicnomadcare.com. Hey, it's Rand with Music Nomad. This video is designed to show you how to set up your guitar using Music Nomad's Keep It Simple setup method. The KISS process uses our precision gauges and tools combined with step-by-step general guidelines anybody can follow and set up their guitar to play and sound great. To get the job done right, you will need our 6-piece precision gauge set that includes a truss rod gauge and pick capo, string action gauge, radius gauge set, nut height gauge, and a 24-page instructional booklet. All of these uniquely designed to make the process much easier and precise than other gauges out there. The 3 Music Nomad tool sets are a 26-piece Guitar Tech screwdriver and wrench set, 11-piece truss rod wrench set, and a diamond-coated nut file set. With these 4 kits, you are able to set up most all guitar and basses out there. Before you get started on your setup, there are some pre-setup steps you should do. Remove all your strings with the Music Nomad grip cutter. With the strings now off, and with the Music Nomad radius gauge, measure and make a note of the fretboard radius, as you will need this info when you measure the string radius in the setup process. Tighten all screws, including the tuning machine bushings, with Music Nomad's Guitar Tech tool set. Polish your frets with Music Nomad's Fine Fret Polish. Clean and condition the fretboard with Music Nomad's F1 oil. Clean the body and neck with Music Nomad cleaners. Finally, put new strings on with Music Nomad's grip winder. Okay, now you're ready to start the setup, featuring our talented guest guitar tech who will lead you through the process. Have fun.
Hi, I'm Geoff Luttrell, owner of San Francisco Guitarworks and Sonoma County Guitarworks, here today to set up this beautiful Paul Reed Smith McCarty 594 using the Music Nomad Keep It Simple setup method. With the goal of making setups accessible to everyone, my collaboration with Music Nomad has created a simple setup process to help you make your guitar play and sound great. Let's get started. So the first thing, let's look at the flow of the steps that we're going to cover in this setup process. The first thing that we're going to do on this instrument is we're going to measure and set our neck relief. So we'll measure the relief at the 6th fret and then we'll adjust our truss rod to set the correct amount of relief in the neck. The next thing that we'll do on this guitar, as it is a fixed bridge, we will set our bridge radius. So using nut files, we will set our bridge radius to match the radius of the fretboard. The next step after that will be to set our action height using the thumb wheels underneath the bridge to raise or lower the bridge to set the action to our specified height for this type of guitar. After we've got our bridge setup done, we'll move back up to this end of the neck and measure and adjust the height of the strings at the 1st fret using nut files, the nut height gauge, and cutting our nut slots correctly for the size of string that we're using. After we've cut the nut slot, we will set our intonation at the bridge, adjusting our saddles back and forth in the bridge to allow the fretted notes to play in tune with the open string. And last but not least, once we've done all that, checked our playability, we will adjust our pickup heights for even output between the bridge and the neck pickup. So I know that you've gone over your instrument as Rand explained during the pre-setup process. So you've cleaned your instrument, you've put new strings on it, you've measured your fretboard radius, and you're ready to move into the setup. I've measured the fretboard radius on this instrument. It is a 10-inch radius, which is very common on Paul Reed Smith. And another thing, I wanted to make sure is that your guitar is in tune, because you want to have the proper amount of string tension on the neck before you do the setup. If your strings, if it's a little bit sharp or a little bit flat, it's not going to be that big of a deal. But if you have it wildly out of tune, the neck relief particularly will change because of the difference in string tension if the strings are overly tight or not tight enough. The first thing I'm going to do on this is measure our neck relief. So the way that we're going to measure our neck relief is we'll use our pick capo to fret at the 1st fret. It's a pretty handy little device to hold down your string so that you don't have to do it. At the 1st fret, you slide the capo over the low E string, under the A, and over the D. So it actually holds the string down at the 1st fret. Then I'll bring the guitar into the playing position. just an easy way to hold a guitar whenever you're doing your setup is if you have a bench that's padded like this one or carpeted, you can set the guitar's waist on the bench and it makes it really easy to hold it. Try not to set it up on the table or some other way. This is just a really easy way to hold the guitar while you're working on it. Once I have my pick capo in and the guitar in the playing position, I will get my truss rod gauge and I will open it up and I'm going to select the 6/1000 of an inch thick feeler gauge, which is the proper starting relief for an electric guitar. To use the gauge, I will push down at the 12th fret. I'll fret my low E string at the 12th fret, and then I'm going to put the gauge between the 6th fret and the low E string. And I'm looking for the gauge to just fill the space between the string and the fret. I don't want there to be a gap between the gauge and the string, and I also don't want the gauge to move the string a lot. I want it to be the gap between the fret and the string to be exactly the same as the gauge. So I'm going to go ahead and push this into the space between the 6th fret and the string. And it is moving the string quite a bit. So I'm going to loosen this truss rod just a touch. Let me just double check that measurement. Yeah, it slides through pretty smoothly, but it's definitely moving the string. So I'm going to loosen the truss rod a little bit. On your truss rod gauge, you'll see that there's a little guide for how to use it. If you have a no touch on the gauge and the string, you'll turn your truss rod to the right, tightening it to take out relief. If you have a very light touch between the string and the fret, you're good to go and you'll leave your relief setting where it is. If you have a heavy touch where it's moving the string quite a bit, you'll turn the truss rod nut counterclockwise to allow more relief into the neck. I'm going to go ahead and use my Music Nomad screwdriver kit here. It's got all the bits that I'll need to do this setup and just about anything else. So I'll go ahead and remove my truss rod cover screw. Just put it in my little bin here. It's always good when you're working on your guitar, if you're doing a setup or anything else, it's good to have a little parts bin so that if you have an errant screw, if you have to take off your truss rod cover, what have you, you have a little place you can put it. It doesn't get kicked around or knocked onto the floor. So as my neck is a little too straight, I'm going to go ahead and back off the truss rod by turning the nut counterclockwise. So I'll get my 5/16 inch truss rod wrench that I'll use for a Paul Reed Smith. Go ahead and put that down into the truss rod cavity and get onto the nut there. And I'm going to turn counterclockwise just ever so slightly. Paul Reed Smith truss rods are pretty sensitive. You don't need to turn them a lot to get some movement. So now I'll go back into the playing position, fret it at the 12th fret, and now we'll measure at the 6th. And that is just perfect. That is just barely grazing the string. So now I have 6/1000 of an inch of relief. Now you might be wondering why 6/1000? Why not 9 or 2? What I have learned over 20 years of doing this, setting up a lot of guitars and having a Plek machine for around 8 years now, whenever a guitar neck is set up with just a small amount of relief, and we would consider 6/1000 of an inch a fairly small amount, you can get a lot more even action up and down the neck. You can set your string action pretty low at the bridge, but still have enough room for the string to oscillate and not buzz on the frets on up the neck. If you can imagine a string affixed at both the nut and the bridge, when you pluck it, it oscillates in an oval pattern generally. It does some whipping initially, but it generally settles into an oval. So if you have a little bit of relief in the neck, you're going to create some room for that string to vibrate without hitting the frets. If your neck is too straight, then in order to create that clearance for the vibrating string, you have to raise the action at the bridge, and that creates a guitar that has really low action in the first position, but then it gets higher and higher as you go up the neck. So if you like an even action up the neck, a little bit of relief is a great way to go. So now I've got my truss rod set correctly, and I'm going to go ahead and just leave my truss rod cover off until I get finished with the setup. You know, I might find if it's a little buzzy down low, I might need to add a little more relief, or if I feel like the action's a bit stiff, maybe I'll take 1/1000th of an inch out of the relief, but I'll just leave the truss rod cover off until I know I'm finished. So having set the relief, we'll move into the bridge radius. On a fixed radius bridge, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to measure your bridge radius and see if it matches what your fretboard radius is. This guitar should have a 10-inch bridge radius due to the fact that we have a 10-inch fretboard radius. I'm going to take a quick look and see what we've got. This is pretty close. The D and the G string are low, but it's touching the E, A, B, and E. So a fixed radius bridge is a little tricky to get set correctly. You have to file the saddles using nut files, just like you would file nut slots. But you have to use the gauge to determine how much material to take off what string. You have to look carefully to see if you have a gap between the string and the gauge itself. If you have trouble seeing that, what you can do is you can set the gauge on the strings very lightly, and then you can push the gauge up and down just very, very lightly, and you can see what strings are moving and what strings are not. And then lastly, if you're still having trouble, set the gauge on very lightly and pluck the strings. So you can hear the E, the A buzzing, the D and G are not, because they're too low, and then my B and my E are buzzing on the gauge. So I'm going to need to cut down the slots for the E, A, B, and E to make that radius a little bit rounder. So what I usually do whenever I'm cutting the slots on a fixed radius bridge is I'll turn the guitar around like so, because I like to be able to see above the bridge to make sure that I'm cutting the slots straight with the string pull and not cutting at any weird angle. And I also can make sure that I'm cutting straight down and I'm not cutting at an angle to the left or to the right. That will change your string spacing. So I have we're setting this guitar up with a set of 10s, and I've got my set of 10 gauge nut files here. And these are the new Music Nomad diamond coated files, and these things are super sweet. I've used every type of file that is available, and these by far cut smoother and a lot more evenly than any file that I've used. And I really like the form factor. You can use them in the handle. They're very comfortable, or if you like, you can pop the file out and just hold it. I mean, sometimes I just use it with just the file itself and don't even use the handle. So you have a couple of different ways that you can use them, but they're really great. Whenever you're selecting a file set for your guitar or bass, you want to make sure that your files are the same size as the string that you're cutting for, or slightly larger. 3 to 4/1000ths of an inch is about as much bigger as I would want to go. Otherwise, the slot starts getting a little bit sloppy. But you just want to make sure that the file is at least as big as the string you're cutting for. So I'm going to grab my 46 file to cut down this low E string. Whenever you're cutting a saddle on a fixed bridge, you want to make sure that you don't, and it's the same with the nut, just at the other end, you want to make sure you don't cut with such an extreme angle that you nick the back of the bridge. You want to always make sure that you leave enough clearance that you don't hit the nickel plating behind the saddle. It's just really sloppy, so don't do that. So what I'm going to do is put the file into the saddle slot. I'm going to get my slight downward angle. I do want to have a slight downward angle to the tailpiece because I want the string to leave the saddle right at the front edge. It makes for a crisp note. If you have a saddle where the slot is flat or even falls off a little bit to the front, you can get a sitaring sound that can sound like fret buzz, but it's really a buzz at the saddle. So I'm going to always make sure that I'm cutting at a downward angle towards the tailpiece. So I'm going to come in here, put my file in the slot. I'm going to go ahead and just give that a little cut, and I'm going to remeasure. Need to go just a little bit more. And since my E and my A are both touching evenly, I'm going to cut those slots together. I'm going to cut the E a little bit and the A a little bit to bring them both down, because I know that they both do need to come down. So I'm going to cut my E a little more. And my A. All right, that's better. I need to go a little more on my low E, but my gauge is just about hitting my D string now. So I know that I'm very close to getting these two down as far as they need to go. All right, that looks good. Now I'm still a little bit low on my G, so I'm going to bring the B and E down just a little bit, and I should be in good shape. So I'll get my 10 and my 13. Actually, that high E needs to come down just a touch. Okay, that is dead on. So you can just feel it. Whenever the radius is right, the gauge it feels very solid. So now I've got all 6 strings are hitting the gauge, and I can just tell by looking at it that we're right on the money there. So now I've got my bridge radius set. So the reason that we want to match our bridge radius to our neck radius is that it makes the playability across the fretboard very even. Some people set the action height by measuring each individual string across the fretboard and try to graduate the strings across by measuring at the 12th fret. But to me, it makes a lot more sense to just set your radius the same as the fretboard, and then you know that you're going to always have an even action height across from the low E to the high E. So now that I've done my radius, I can set my action height. So using my string action gauge, which is really this is a really great gauge. It's very easy to see. We've done a white lettering on a black background. It's much easier to see than the more typical gray stainless with the black etching. It's just tougher to see. This is very easy to look at. And we've got a chart on both sides. That one is the recommended action height for electric guitar, acoustic guitar, and bass in inches, and then the other side is metric. There's also metric and SAE rulers and some conversion charts, so it's a really useful little tool. So what I'm going to do to use this is I'm going to put the guitar back in the playing position, and I'm going to fret at the first fret. I'm going to use the side of the gauge that is in inches. It shows the measure at the 12th fret, top of the fret to the bottom of the string. And on there's a chart, and I'm going to check out my electric chart and look at my most common action height for an electric guitar is going to be 60 thousandths of an inch of action on the bass side and 50 thousandths on the treble side. Now that is a very commonly used action spec at my shop. If you came in and said, hey, just set up my guitar, I just really want it to play comfortably, just play a wide range of music, and that I just want it to play great, we would set it at 60-50. If you have a really heavy hand, you might need to go a little bit higher. If you have a very delicate touch, you can handle a little bit of fret buzz, you might be able to go a little lower, but that's a really good starting point. So that's what we're going to use on this guitar. So I'm going to fret at the first fret and put the gauge behind the low E string, and what I'm looking for is I want the bottom of the string to rest right on top of the 60 line. And right now it is covering the 60 line, so it's a little bit too low on the bass side. Now I'll do the same thing. I'll measure on the treble side, and I want the string to be sitting right on top of the 50 line, which is the 0.05, and I will see that it is covering the 50 line, so it's a little low. So what I'll do to adjust that is I will turn these two bridge thumb wheels counterclockwise. And what that does is the thumb wheels are on a screw post. So when you turn them counterclockwise, you're basically unscrewing them, and they're going to lift up the post and they're going to raise the bridge. If you turn them to the right, clockwise, you're going to drive them down the post, and it's going to let the bridge drop and lower the action. But I want to raise the action, so I'm going to turn them counterclockwise just a little bit. Probably won't need more than about a half a turn on each. And then I'm going to remeasure my action. I went a little too far on that bass side, so turn that down just a touch. So now I'm sitting right on top of the 60 line, and I am right on top of the 50 line. So thumb wheels, if the bridge doesn't have too much pressure, you can usually adjust your thumb wheels by hand. But if you are having trouble, you can, a couple of things. One, you can loosen your strings, just take the tension off the bridge, and you can then adjust them by hand. Or you can use the Music Nomad spanner wrench. If you put it on in one direction, you can use it to adjust counterclockwise, and if you put it on in the other direction, you can use it to adjust clockwise. So one to take it down, one to take it up. They're really handy. So they work really well on Les Pauls. They often have a lot of down pressure on that bridge, and they have really small thumb wheels. So it can be really hard to turn those posts, but with the wrench, it makes it a lot easier. So now I've got my action set. I'm going to tune back to pitch because I've done my filing on the saddles, and I have raised the action. So I want to make sure that I'm still in tune. Okay. So having set the action, got it back in tune, you can just give it a play. Make sure that you're playing cleanly everywhere. Basically, you're going to be listening for fret rattle. If you do a lot of bending, you're going to want to bend in the upper registers and make sure that it bends cleanly. This bends super clean at 50 thou, so that's, the fretwork on this guitar is really good. If you have a modern Fender or a guitar with a little bit rounder radius, it's really imperative that your fretwork is accurate in order to be able to play with this low of action without fretting out when you're bending. So just if you get your action set to spec, and then you find that you have you're fretting out in certain areas, you may have some fret imperfections and might need to have some fret work done. All right, so now I've got my relief setting done, set at 6/1000ths of an inch. I've set my bridge radius to 10, which matches my fretboard radius, and I've set my action at my bridge to 60 thousandths on the bass side and 50 thousandths on the treble side, which is just a good, standard, comfortable action for an electric guitar. So now that I've got all that set, I'm going to move into measuring the nut height and cutting the slots correctly. In order to do that, I'm going to need a couple of different gauges. I'm going to need my nut height gauge, which is very similar to the relief gauge. It's a series of feeler gauges. These are really cool. They have only the sizes that you need. If you buy some at the hardware store, they've got a lot more than you're ever going to use, and they're all covered in oil, so they're kind of a hassle to use. But these are very clearly marked, not only in the thickness, but also in the string that you'll use it for and what type of instrument it'll be used for. It has some instruction on the handle about how to use the gauge. If you put the gauge between the string and the first fret, and the gauge touches both the string and the fret, then you won't need to do any filing on the nut slot. If there's a space, then you will file the nut slot. So we'll get into how to use this right now. I'm going to use the same set of files that I used to file my bridge radius. The same rules apply as far as what size files you're going to use. You're going to make sure that you have files that are the same size as your strings or slightly bigger, just ever so slightly, maybe up to 3 or 4 thousandths of an inch. And we will do the same. We'll do the same type of thing at the nut as we did at the bridge. We're going to file down at a little bit of an angle so that we make sure we have a good clean takeoff point at the front edge of the nut. Now, cutting the nut slots correctly is really important for a variety of reasons. If you have your nut cut too high, your intonation at the first fret can suffer. Your string action is too high, and then as you push the string down, you're stretching it, and that's making it go sharp until it finally hits the fret, and now it's sharper than it should be. Also, just having a nut cut incorrectly can adversely impact the feel of the instrument. If their nut slots are all too high, it's just unpleasant to play. If they're uneven, it just feels weird. If they're too low, it can buzz. Now, we're obviously not going to be able to fix that with nut files. You would need to either have a new nut made or make a new nut, or you need to fill the individual slots and recut them. So in order to measure my nut height, I'm going to put the guitar in the playing position, and then I'm going to get my nut height gauge. So for this guitar, we're going to use a 20 thousandths of an inch gauge for the low E and the A string. Then we'll use an 18 thousandths of an inch gauge for the D and the G, and then we'll use a 16 for the B and the high E. Now all that's clearly labeled on the gauge, so it's really easy to find, and it's really intuitive. So what we do is, just like measuring the relief, I'll take the gauge and I'll slide it between the fret and the string. Now I can see that I've got a gap between the fret and the string. So I can put the gauge between, and I can tap, and I can see and hear that I've got some space. Okay, so now we've measured our nut height at the first fret and found that it's a little high on the low E string. So I'm going to go ahead and tune down, and I'm going to take the string out of the nut slot. Now I'll grab my 46 file, and I'm going to come into I like to stand over the instrument so I can see down on the nut. I've had some students, try to kind of go from the side. It's hard for me to do it that way. I like to be able to see from the top, because I can see that I'm filing in a straight line, that I don't have the file angled, and I can also see that I'm filing straight down and the file is not tilted and drifting the string spacing one direction or the other. So I'm going to go ahead and put the nut file in the slot, and I'm going to angle down a couple of degrees, and I'm just going to go ahead and make a little cut. Now, if you haven't done this before, really be careful. You can easily cut too low, but if you take it slow and are methodical and do the same thing every time, you should be able to get a feel for it pretty quickly. So now that I've taken a little material off, I will go ahead, put the string back in, retune, back in the playing position, and let's measure again. Still got a little gap there, so I'm going to want to go down a little more. Back to pitch, back in the playing position. There we go. Now it's sliding in very nicely. I can feel just a tiny bit of drag on the gauge, but there is no gap there, and it's not noticeably moving the string, so I know I'm right at 20 thousandths of an inch. There's a little bit of leeway built into these measurements. They're definitely low enough that the guitar is going to play very comfortably and play in tune, but if you accidentally go down a couple of thousandths of an inch and it's not buzzing, don't worry about it. There's a little bit of wiggle room there, but try to nail the measurements, but don't worry if you go a little low, you're probably still going to be okay. So now I'm going to go ahead and move into the A string. So I'm going to slide the gauge on over to the A, and I am definitely a little high on that A string. So I'm going to go ahead and put the guitar back down on the cradle cube, loosen my A string, get my 36 file here, back in the slot, and then back to pitch, back in the playing position, and that is right on the money, right on the money. So, all right, Now that I've done my E and the A, I'm going to drop down to my 18,000ths of an inch gauge, which is labeled D and G on guitar, and I'm going to move over to the D string and measure it. Go ahead and slide the gauge in under the E and the A string, and you can actually lift up a little bit on it to make sure that the end of it is tight on the fret. And then you're going to put it just under the D, and that D is very high. I'm kind of surprised to see that. Paul Reed Smith guitars, the setups are usually really tight. This one's a little higher than I'd expect, but not terrible, but we're definitely going to improve it. This is one of those guitars, like the whole time you're working on it, you're like, God, that's a pretty guitar. Come in. Back to pitch. Back to playing position. That's closer. It's about half as far as I needed to go. And when I'm filing, I'm trying to keep a constant angle. Every time I go in and cut, I'm trying to keep the file at the same angle. I see that really commonly in my classes. A student will be cutting at a little bit too severe of an angle, and they'll say, hey, man, Geoff, I've been cutting and cutting, and I'm not, this nut is not lowering at all. And that's because what they're doing is they're cutting the back edge of the slot off. They're not really cutting the front. And so I say, oh, your file's a little too steep, and then whenever they flatten it out, they cut that peak off, and then now the nut is too low. So if you pick a nice gentle angle and just stick to it so that you'll be able to know what to expect. When you cut 5 strokes, it goes a certain amount. It's not a different amount every time. And that is right on the money. So now I will come in from the treble side, and I'll come in under the G, and we got a pretty good amount of space there. Yeah, this definitely has quite a bit to drop on that one. So I'm just going to pop that out of the slot, get my 17. One more go. That looks good. Just slides under the string, but no visible movement above the gauge. So now for my last 2 strings, I'll drop down to my 16,000ths of an inch gauge, which is labeled B and high E for guitar. And I will come in from the treble side, and I can see already this B is a mile high. Yeah, that needs to come down quite a bit. So I will get my 13 gauge on that. Back in the playing position, back under the strings. That is just about right. It just barely moves the string when I push it under, so that is A-okay. And then last but not least, got my high E. That's actually looking really good. So now I can go ahead and make sure that I'm in tune. And make sure that I don't have any buzzing on the open notes. Everything sounds nice. So now we've set our neck relief, we've set our bridge radius, we've set our action height, and we've cut our nut slots to their correct depth to achieve the proper string action at the first fret. So now that we've gone through all that, we'll go ahead and we'll do our intonation. So intonation is what makes the guitar, the fretted notes play in tune with the open string. And to achieve proper intonation, we have what's called compensation, which is the movement of the saddle forward and backward to adjust the scale length to compensate for the stretching of the string as you push it down to the fret. So as you're pushing your string down to the fret, it's bending, just like if you're bending a note. And so as that's raising the tension, if you had no compensation at your saddles, all your fretted notes would be sharp because of that stretching of the string. So in order to eliminate that sharpness at the fretted notes, we compensate by lengthening the scale to make those notes flatter as they get fretted. So the way that we'll do that is we'll get our open string in tune, perfectly in tune. This is where it matters a lot to have your strings accurately tuned. Then we'll fret at the 12th fret and at the 17th fret. And if our fretted notes are flat, we're going to move the saddle forward to shorten the scale. If our fretted notes are sharp, we will move the saddles back to lengthen the scale. On this guitar, and on most guitars, in order to do that, I will adjust the saddles back and forth by using these saddle adjustment screws. So on this guitar, they're in the back. You'll have to come at it from the back side of the bridge. On many guitars with fixed bridges, Les Pauls, SGs, that type of thing, sometimes the screws are on the back, sometimes they're on the front. You know, the bridges get turned around. But once the saddles are slotted correctly for the strings, you're not going to want to turn the bridge in order to make the saddle screws be on one side or the other. So if you buy a guitar that's used and this bridge is one way or the other, if the saddles are slotted that way, I would just roll with it and not worry too much about it. But this guitar, they're going to be on the back. So I'll put the guitar in playing position. So we'll get my string right in tune. If you have a tuner that's a little bit finicky and it has a hard time really locking in on the note, one thing that you can do is put your guitar on both pickups, make sure your volumes are all the way up, and then turn down the tone knobs. And what that will do is it will reduce the high frequency that the tuner sees, and it will allow it to lock in on the fundamental of the note, and it can help the tuner really lock onto the note and make your intonation a lot easier. So right here, we will set our tuning exactly. So there is an E right on the money. So I'm going to fret at the 12th fret, tiny bit flat, but not really enough to worry about, and the 17th fret. That's perfect. I mean, that's about as good as you could ever hope for. So I'm not going to move that. I'm going to move on to the A string. I'm going to go ahead and make sure it's tuned right to pitch. So here's our A, right on the money. That's perfect. And then our 17th, that is just perfect. Let's move over to our D. Looks really good. That's great. Tiny bit sharp on that G, so I'm going to go ahead and pull the saddle back just a hair. If you have to be sharp or flat, I would rather be a tiny bit flat because you can always bend up to the note. You can't bend down very easily. But if you have a strobe tuner and it's just barely scrolling, you're not going to hear that anyway. But I'm going to go ahead and flatten this out just a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and tune down so I can get that out of the string out of the way. And I'm going to turn my screw clockwise to pull the saddle back to lengthen the scale. So I'm just going to go about a turn on that screw. tune. Okay, looks great. It's dead on the money. It's perfect. Let's get that G right on. It's great. And then 17th, that's perfect. So they did a really good job of intonating this guitar at the factory. It's needs very little. If I could have left that D alone, you would have not ever heard that slight imperfection, but why not get it perfect? It's right on the money. It's about as good as you're going to hope for. Well, that's about as dialed as they get. So since I didn't have to do a lot of adjustment on this one, I just want to recap the process behind intonation to make sure that it's clear for everyone. You tune your open string perfectly, then you fret your 12th fret and play it. If that note is flat, you're going to move your saddle forward to sharpen the note by shortening the scale. If the fretted note is sharp, you're going to move your saddle back to flatten the note by lengthening the scale. So this guitar just didn't really need very much. So we've now done our neck relief, we've set our bridge radius and our action height, we've cut our nut slots correctly, and we have now intonated. So the last thing that we'll do is we'll set our pickup heights. There are some specs for pickup heights that we use that will definitely get you into the ballpark. Every guitar is different. You know, they resonate different. They have different frequency peaks. You're going to have different outputs between the bridge and the neck pickup. And you know, definitely feel free to experiment beyond the specs that we give. If you feel like your pickup is too loud, lower it. If you feel like it's too quiet, raise it. You know, that's really that's all there is to it. The method that I use is I'll set the bridge pickup first and then I'll match the neck pickup to it. So I will go ahead and set my bridge pickup using my specs here in my setup booklet. You can go back to page 21 if you have the booklet. And for a humbucker guitar, we're going to use a 1/16 of an inch away from the strings on the treble pickup and 3/32 away on the bass pickup or bridge pickup, neck pickup, however you want to say it. So I'm going to set to a 1/16 of an inch on the bridge pickup. That's going to be fretted at the last fret. I'm going to use my pickup height ruler that I have here on the corner of the string action gauge to measure that pickup height. So fretted at the last fret, I'm well below a 1/16. It's much farther away. It's 3/32. Yeah, it's almost 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to go ahead and raise that up a little bit. And we've got on this guitar, we've got Phillips screws. Anytime you're adjusting your humbucker adjustment screws, you want to be sure that you hold your screwdriver very securely. This guitar, Paul Reed Smith has been kind enough to have the screw heads recessed, so it's a little bit less prone to losing the screwdriver. Often Gibsons, especially the historic or traditional models, they'll have a flathead screw, which is authentic to the older guitars, but it is a little bit harder to keep the screwdriver in the screw head. So anytime you're using a humbucker adjusting screwdriver, go ahead and make sure that you hold the screwdriver very carefully in the screw, especially if it's a flat blade. I've seen more than one Les Paul come in with a ding on the top from somebody jumping out of the screw. So just be aware of that. It's not a big deal, but just another thing to think about. So I'm going to measure the pickup height. I'm going to set it to a 1/16 now. I'm pretty close. Raising it up was just about enough, but I'm going to go ahead and raise it just a hair more. Okay, that is a 1/16 right on the money. Then I'm going to go 3/32 on my neck pickup drop it down just a little bit lower. The string has a larger excursion at the neck pickup, so it produces more output. So you usually want to have the neck pickup a little bit lower, and the neck pickup is usually wound a little bit cooler than the bridge pickup to help compensate for that as well. But they're almost always a little bit lower from the strings than the bridge pickup. Okay, 332, 332. All right, so to get my actual adjustment by ear, I'll just plug in and give it a strum. So that's my bridge pickup. A lot more output on that neck pickup. So I'm going to lower the neck pickup down a little bit. Okay, we'll turn it back up and give it another. Still a little bit hot on that neck pickup. I'm going to bring it down just a touch more. And I think we'll be in pretty good shape. So that sounds very even from pickup to pickup. The bridge pickup has a nice cut to it. The bass pickup or the neck pickup has a nice warm sound, but it's not overly bassy. Occasionally you'll have a pickup that's either very bright or very bassy, and you can tilt it one way or the other to compensate for that. If you have a neck pickup that's really boomy, lower the bass side and bring up the treble side. Conversely, with a bridge pickup, if it's overly trebly, you can lower the treble side and bring up the bass, and you can compensate a little bit for that tendency to be boomy or too cutting. So now we have gone completely through this setup from neck relief, bridge radius and action, cutting the nut correctly, setting our intonation, and setting our pickup heights. So I'm going to go ahead and put my truss rod cover back on now. I didn't need to do any further adjustments on that. And this thing is ready to rock and roll. So I hope that you've enjoyed going through the Paul Reed Smith setup process. But yeah, all in all, the build quality of PRS are great. So you know, as you get into your setup on them, just follow the guidelines, and you'll come out with a guitar that really really plays and sounds great. So thanks a lot for watching the video, and good luck with your setup.
For detailed videos on how to use each gauge during the setup process, please visit musicnomadcare.com for all our how-to videos.